So as I mentioned a minute ago, we're going to continue in our study of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. Today we're going to cover 2nd John. This is the next to last study in this quarter. And Lord willing, next week we'll come back and finish with a study of 3rd John. But today we will focus on 2nd John. As we talked about way back at the beginning of the quarter, the author of this particular book is generally accepted and understood to be John the Apostle. It was likely written while in Asia Minor, in the area of modern-day Turkey, kind of in the western part of that particular country as we know it today, after John had left Jerusalem as part of the evacuation before, for those that were believers, before the destruction of Jerusalem happened in AD 70. So it happened sometime between that point in time, most likely, and his exile on the island of Patmos, which occurred in the early to mid-90s. Most scholars would have us understand, or many scholars would have us understand. And so it was written somewhere in that time frame, likely written post 1st John that we just studied. And in our study in this single chapter book, the way it's presented, there are three main sections or topics that we're going to cover in our study today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the greetings that John incorporates into this particular letter, and relative to those that he's writing to. We're going to talk a little bit about some continuing admonitions, and these build on the things that we've been talking about all quarter and things that he shared in his first letter, 1 John. And then we're gonna conclude by focusing on some warnings that John provides in his writing here, primarily around false teachers and the need and the essentiality of pure doctrine. So those are the three things that we're going to talk about this morning. So with that said, let's jump into our reading. 2nd John, we're going to read verses 1 through 3 to begin. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. All right, so the writer and the readers is how John begins. First, there's this reference to the elder. And again, this is likely a reference to John himself writing very much late in his earthly life, likely the last of the living apostles that God had appointed, okay? We know from the rest of the New Testament that this term elder has reference to not only those who are older, but also those from an authoritative perspective in the context of the local congregation. And from a local congregation perspective, there's always a plurality of elders. There's not a single elder where that the article "the" in this particular passage references the elder. So this is not talking about John as the lead elder in a local congregation, because such did not exist in the New Testament, and based on the pattern that's been given to us, doesn't exist today. John is writing this as the elder, the senior statesman, as it were, the senior and perhaps last living apostle, who was that eyewitness that we talked about, and that John begins his gospel account, and John begins 1 John talking about the fact that he was an eyewitness. He heard, he saw, he touched and felt Jesus having come in the flesh. So the elder is writing to the elect lady and her children. Now, depending upon the commentators that you read, there are several different particular and potential interpretations of who John is writing to. It's interesting how scholars can take a very staunch position on their particular understanding of this passage in particular, other passages, and defend it to the nth degree. I think you can go multiple ways. I certainly have a particular opinion, but the two primary ideas or thoughts here are that John is either writing to an actual lady who's part of the elect, perhaps even her name is related somehow to that concept of election, or and then her physical children, okay? Or he's writing to a personification of the church, specifically a local congregation, and writing to them. I happen to think that he's writing to a particular congregation, a local church that's meeting in an area that he intends to travel to. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Primarily because in this verse, it says, to the elder, to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. There's the potential, and we've got a number of large families that are here. There's the potential that all who were part of the truth could know an individual, a particular family. But I think that's less likely than someone understanding, or all those who love the truth understanding, that there is this beacon that represented by a congregation who's doing God's work in a particular way. And so I happen to think that this is likely a congregation. But again, I don't think, we don't know. We don't know for sure. Bill? Okay. Yeah. So, Bill, for those that may be online, those in the auditorium didn't hear, there's a reference to, or Bill was making a comment that the church is often referred to in the feminine, from a feminine perspective, the bride of Christ, and he sees in this that John is perhaps writing to the church universal, and I can see that as well. There's reference to the sister of the elect sister and her children, which creates some interesting ideas there, and that's why I kind of lean towards more a congregation, because I can understand in the broad sense the church being female and potentially sister congregations having fellowship and relationship. But I don't think we can go necessarily wrong in any of these areas. The Bible, I don't think, is exactly clear, but it's interesting to think about. And better help us understand what John is speaking to here. Good comment. Good comment. All right. So the truth is referenced in what we just read. In those short 3 verses, the truth is mentioned 4 times, and that's interesting. Love and truth go together. Some things are better together. Well, the truth and love in John's writings that we've been studying about, and in this particular book, this short 1-chapter book, love and truth go together. We'll talk about that several times. The truth abides in God's people. Those who are in fellowship with God have the truth abiding in them, and the truth will be forever, according to what John says here. When we've talked about this throughout, John often is referring back to things that Jesus taught while in the flesh. And one of the things that John recorded in his gospel that we've referred to many times, John 14, verse 6, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except by me. The truth is mentioned extensively here. And God and his Son are one, and they've given us a number of things that are referenced here. Grace, God's favor toward us in spite of our sin. God and his Son have given us mercy. They've had compassion on us. They've delivered us from the guilt and the wrath that would come our way as a result of our guilt. God and His Son have given us peace. They've given us a relationship and an ability to experience peace by removing the guilt of sin that was against us. We've referenced Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 11 many times in this study, and I think it fits. While sinners, God sent Jesus. He died for us, and based on His death, we're saved from God's wrath. We're justified by His blood. We're reconciled to God in relationship through that act of love. Now, it's interesting, this is much more formatted as a letter that we're familiar with today, but also in the context of the canon. There are a number of other books and writers, Paul and Peter in particular, that use similar concepts and phraseology as they greet others in their writing. And I've given you a number of references in the handout, Paul writing to the church in Corinth, in 2 Corinthians in particular, Paul writing to the young preacher Timothy, in 1 Timothy, Peter, and beginning 1 Peter and 2 Peter uses very similar greeting. All right, so with that in mind, let's move to the next section of this book, 2 John. We'll read verses 4 through 6. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we've had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to His commandments. This is the commandment, just as you've heard from the beginning, so that you walk in it. All right. Again, very familiar relative to what we've been studying in this class for the last quarter. I think it's important for us to see first that John is rejoicing that the children of the elect lady were walking in truth. But he uses a term, some. Some. That means some were not walking in the truth. Some were not walking in the truth. He's not sugarcoating this. He's calling this out as he sees it, but I believe, and I see in John, an accentuation of the positive, as the old song goes. I'm sure he could have gone down a path of talking about those who were not walking in the truth. But John here is choosing to rejoice in that some are walking in the truth. Sometimes what we think about and what we dwell on impacts our whole worldview and our whole attitude and disposition. We can choose sometimes to focus, and sometimes we need to focus on negative issues and circumstances and deal with those. But from a way of life and understanding our place relative to God, we will do far better in life if we accentuate the positive, if we focus on the positive. We esteem the positive in our minds. We can become negative if we're not careful. And that negativity can lead us to places that we really don't want to go. And again, I'm not saying that we don't need to take a stand, because pure doctrine is a part of what John's talking about, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute. But here, he's choosing to rejoice in that some of the children of the elect lady are walking in truth. And as we've talked about, walking is a metaphor for a lifestyle. That's what John's writing about here. As he talks about walking, he's not literally talking about just, going on a walk. He's talking about our lifestyle. Brother John.
Can we know, even today, who are walking in the truth? Can we say this brother, this sister are truly walking in the truth? Can we see that today?
I would suggest that we can, at least in part. We can't see the heart, but what we can do is we can see the fruit. We can see the lifestyle. And we've seen John talk about the fact that we will be able to see them by their fruits. Those who profess one thing and do another, those are not true prophets. But those who walk in the light as he is in the light have their sins forgiven. And so we have been given a rule of measure in the Word. We're to test the spirits, as John said in 1 John, to understand whether they're from God or not from God. And while we are not the ones pronouncing judgment, God is the sole person who's pronouncing judgment. We have been given tools that allow us to discern between those who are walking in the light and those who are not. And if there's any doubt or question, then we're called to love in a selfless way our brothers, because we're in fellowship with them. If they're in fellowship with God, we're in fellowship with them, and we need to seek to encourage and build them up. So good thoughts there. We can't see the heart, but we can see the fruit. We can see the lifestyle. And the lifestyle, I think, is what John's talking about, because we're going to talk about deception in a minute. If we say we have no sin, any of us, if we say we have no sin, we've deceived ourselves. The truth is not in us. We are liars, and we make God a liar if we say that. So none of us are perfect in that sense. We're not. Good thoughts. Good thoughts. I can't help but think about, just from a personal perspective, all of us, for the most part, have probably worshiped with at least one more congregation. Many of us have worshiped with many congregations. And isn't it a joy when we're able to reconvene with people that we've worshiped with in the past, and we hear stories about how folks have grown in their faith and how they are continuing to be faithful in God's service? Isn't that a point of rejoicing for us? And I think the same is true in this particular case as well. All right. Love and truth go together. And both are demonstrated not only by what we say, but what we do. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, this commandment to love one another is not a new commandment. And he used the same language in the first book that we've been studying. Whether this from the beginning reference is going all the way back to the old law and the Shema and loving God with our whole being and loving others as he would have us to do under the old law, or whether this is going back to the ministry of Jesus in the beginning of this particular age, where Jesus said that you'll be my disciples and you're going to be known by the love that you have one for another. As I have loved you, so you must also love one another. He back in 1 John chapter 2, he said essentially the same thing. Remember the old command, but it's not an old command, that we are to love one another. And in this passage, again, he reminds us that love ultimately is demonstrated by following his commandments. Whoever abides in his teaching has both the Father and the Son. We're going to get to that in verse 9 in a minute. Again, at this particular time, there was this emerging teaching that was happening where some were attempting to discount Jesus having come in the flesh. If Jesus came in the flesh because the flesh, according to these false teachers, was evil, then Jesus was not divine. And so there was this potential divide between the Father and the Son. And yet Jesus, when he came, was very clear that he and the Father are one. And John has been very clear. If we aspire and desire to have the Father, we must also have the Son. In having the Father and the Son, we also have one another. We can't create a line of division between those, our brothers and sisters, some who are in fellowship with God, but I'm not going to have fellowship with that brother or that sister. No, if we're in fellowship with God, we are in fellowship with one another. There is no divide. There's no divide there. 1 John 3:23 that we, again, studied earlier in the quarter, loving one another is a key part of the commandments that we've been given. Paul, writing to the Christians in Rome, Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the debt of love to one another. You remember from Jesus' teaching directly, as John recorded in his gospel, John chapter 14 and verse 15 says, "If you love me, you'll keep my commandments." In the next chapter, chapter 15, verses 13 and 14, he says, "No greater love has any man than to lay down his life for his friends. You're my friends if you do what I command you." And as we've discussed then, and we'll bring it up again, we've been challenged to offer ourselves as living sacrifices. Paul writing to the church in Rome, Romans chapter 12, verse 1. We are to lay down our lives following the commandments that we've been given by Jesus, and in doing so, we are demonstrating the greatest act of love according to what our Lord and Savior taught and what our Lord and Savior did in his body in literally laying down his life. We, as living sacrifices, are called to obey him, laying down our lives, our wills, in favor of his to bring him honor and glory. So loving others means laying down our lives. Let's turn back over to 1 John very quickly, 1 John chapter 3. I think it's well said there, and just as a point of remembering this old command and the teaching that he's given us already. 1 John chapter 3, we'll begin verse reading in 16. "So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because he is, so also we are in this world. There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." All right, so actually I read verse, I was thinking, no, that's not what I thought I was going to read. I just read chapter 4, verse 16. Let me go back to chapter 3, verse 16. Sorry about that. 3, verse 16. "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." So we're called not to love in word or talk only. We are called to love in word and talk, but not word or talk only. That love should compel us, should move us to acting, to demonstrating, to obeying. And that obedience often involves meeting the needs of other people, whatever those needs may be. We can't close our heart to other people in need and say we have love, according to what John has said. All right, so in the balance of remaining time, let's move into the last part of this particular book, the third major section. We'll deal with the final greetings as part of our wrap-up. Beginning in verse 7 of 2 John, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works." All right. So John here is returning to a theme that he addressed, at least in part, in the book of 1 John, that deceivers have gone out into the world. Back in 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 through 19, he speaks of those who are against Christ, those antichrists, plural. There are more than one. Those who take a position opposite Christ in his incarnation, while maintaining his deity, are considered antichrist, against Christ. In verse 18 and 19, he talks about some that had left from the group. And verse 26 speaks to their motives. They are seeking to deceive. They're seeking to deceive and draw away. And those that John's writing about aren't the only ones that are written about in the New Testament relative to this desire to deceive and to draw away. Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, Galatians 2 and verse 4, speaks of those who had infiltrated the body. They were false brethren. They had come in seeking to bring those who were of the faith into sin and into the slavery that comes with sin. Paul, addressing those Ephesian elders in his last address to them, as recorded by Luke in Acts chapter 20, speaks to the fact that fierce wolves are going to come in, even from among that group. They're not going to spare the flock. They're going to twist the truth of God in order to draw away disciples to follow after them for their own glory. Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, speaks of some disguising themselves as apostles of Christ for the purpose of deceit. Those who are deceiving are intending to mislead, to misdirect, to draw away. In some cases, that could be through direct and overt teaching falsely. In some cases, it could be omitting things that should be taught. And Paul, when talking to those Ephesian elders, was speaking about the fact that he always declared the whole counsel of God. He did not shy away from teaching the whole counsel of God. Beyond the fact that others are seeking to deceive, self-deception is something that we need to be particularly concerned about. John, when he began the book of 1 John, in that first chapter, you remember verses 8 through 10, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. Pride can create blind spots in our lives. Jesus, if we carry this to its ultimate situation and ultimate fulfillment, some of the most chilling verses in all the Bible, Jesus, as recorded by Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, speaks of true and false prophets. He speaks of true and false disciples. He says that many will say, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? Did we not perform miracles in your name, Jesus? And Jesus, in that passage, says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Whether those had been deceived or in part had been deceived and participated in that deception with self-deception, they had an expectation of a relationship with Jesus, and yet Jesus says, "I never knew you." Self-deception is something that we really need to guard against. Ultimately, because, as John said and recorded, I should say as John recorded, and as Jesus said in John 8:44, Satan is the father of all lies. Satan is the father of all lies. All right. So beyond deception, those who do not confess the incarnation of Jesus while maintaining the fact that he is divine, those stand in contrast to the children of the elect lady who are walking in truth that he just talked about in his greeting. There is a clear line of demarcation. They are antichrists. They are deceivers. And again, this is not a singular reference, as we've talked about in previous classes. Antichrist is not an individual so much as it's a collection or anyone who would take a position opposite Jesus and his divine nature. So let's talk a little bit about doctrine and teaching. So that's clearly referenced here in 2 John. And I can't help but think about walking. We like to walk as a family. And as our kids were growing up, and then as now our grandkids are part of the mix, There's a game that we often play. You've probably played it as well, kind of a red light, green light, yellow light concept where the children get to walk a little bit further ahead, and we can change behaviors or modify behaviors if there's compliance in place, where we slow down with the yellow light, we stop with the red light until we catch up, we give them the green light, and then they can move on ahead. So Jesus' doctrine is essential. It's vital. Jesus, as John recorded in his gospel accounts, John chapter 7 and 8 in particular, John chapter 7, verse 11, while Jesus is teaching in Jerusalem, that teaching prompts the crowd to take sides. Jesus is good. Jesus is attempting to deceive us. In that context, Jesus says, my teaching is not mine, but it's his who sent me. Jesus' doctrine is aligned with what God, the Father, wants us to know. And later in John chapter 8, Jesus said, he who sent me is trustworthy. What I heard from him, I am telling the world. Later, when Jesus was interacting with Pilate, as recorded in John's Gospel, John chapter 18, verses 36 and 37, Jesus said it was for this reason that I came into the world to testify of the truth, and that truth involves who he is ultimately. And Paul, writing to Timothy, refers to Jesus as a faithful witness. Now, it's interesting, in some of the common translations we use, in the English version, there's the English Standard Version, there's this reference to goes on ahead in the relative to the doctrine. Verse 9 in particular is what I'm referring to. In the King James Version, it says goeth onward. In the NIV, that word is translated runs ahead. So at this time, and even today, false teachers think, and sometimes teach, that they know better, and they are able to go beyond what has been revealed. But the doctrine of Christ, the doctrine that God has given to us, is perfect. We don't go beyond what has been revealed and written. Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 4:6, says, don't go beyond what is written. Again, Paul made that reference to teaching the whole counsel of God in his address to those Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20. In 2 Timothy 2, Paul, writing to that young preacher, says, be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. This is consistent even in the Old Testament. Ezekiel, that prophet, in Ezekiel 3, speaks of being a watchman, and the fact that the prophets of old were expected to share exactly what God had revealed. And the same is true for us today. We are called to share what God has revealed. When I think about some of the legal shows that I watched as a kid growing up, I can remember the swearing in the courtroom of a witness. I affirm, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Relative to what we teach and preach, we need to stand and preach and teach the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Doctrine is important. Deviating from the doctrine of Jesus to any degree results in a severing of our relationship with God and his Son. One who does not abide in Jesus' doctrine is not abiding with God, the Father, and the Son. But if we abide in the doctrine, we have relationship with the Father and the Son. Relative to these false teachers who are out teaching and seeking to deceive, those who are beyond the doctrine of Jesus, those who are against Christ, John says we're not to receive them into your house. We're not to give them any greeting. Okay? We're not to extend a commendation or approval for them in any way. Now, we are told elsewhere in Scripture to do good to all men, especially those who are of the household of faith. Sometimes we think that we can get into a conflict, but you remember what Peter and John said when they were called in front of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem in the early days of the church. It's up to you whether you can decide what you want to do with us, but relative to what we're going to do, we're going to choose to obey God rather than men. If we see things at odds, it's because of our inability to understand. Love and truth go together. Love and truth go together, according to what John is saying here. And so, from a hierarchy perspective, the truth should influence our willingness and ability to support and encourage those who are teaching the truth versus those who are teaching error. If we support and encourage those who are teaching error, we, according to what John says here, are participating in their evil works. We must abide in the doctrine of Christ. We must abide in the doctrine of Christ. And again, contextually, we're talking about those who have taken a position against Christ, those who are seeking to deceive, those who've gone on ahead. They've left the doctrine of Christ. So there's a twofold warning that follows up here. In verse 8, don't lose the reward that you've worked for, okay? Watch yourselves so that we don't lose what we've worked for and so that we'll win a full reward. Jesus taught relative to the parable of the laborers in the vineyard that there is a reward that's coming at the end of the day, and it's the good pleasure of the vineyard owner to pay and recompense those who have worked in the field. John, writing in Revelation 2:10, while writing to, I believe, in that case, he's writing specifically to the church in Smyrna, and I think there's a corollary here, but again, just an opinion. But writing there to the church in Smyrna, he says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." There are blessings that we enjoy in this life by staying in the doctrine and by loving one another, but the full reward comes when Jesus returns, and we all receive that crown of life. All right, let's wrap this up. Verses 12 and 13 of 2 John. "Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elect sister greet you." All right. So this letter was written by John as a temporary measure to encourage his readers and to instruct them. John expected to come and meet with them in person. John is passing along some greetings to them from former members of that congregation. And as we said before, that's such a sweet thought relative to our experience. We got to experience some of that with our recent homecoming and anniversary celebration, where we had some folks that we've known in the past that came to be with us, and that was a joy. I think this is a timely message for all of us relative to our communications. In-person communication, especially encouragement and instruction, is going to be best delivered in person. So much of our communication is nonverbal. And when we resort to text messages and writing, which can be helpful in a temporary measure and all of that, if we exclusively use those, we are circumventing our ability to communicate effectively with brothers and sisters and have them hear and understand what we are attempting to communicate, and vice versa. In-person communication is always going to be the best possible communication, the richest form of communication. We can't always avail ourselves of that. We can better today than ever before, but even there, I think this is a very important admonition for us to think about how we can communicate in person. living and loving in the truth. Being wary of false teachers and protecting the doctrine of Jesus Christ. Watching ourselves in light of the fact that an eternal reward is in the balance and is in our future. I think those are the things that John is writing about as he's hoping to come and spend more time with them in person. Thank you for your attention this morning. Thank you for those of you that commented. Lord willing, we'll be back next week and we'll focus on 3 John and we'll conclude our study. God bless you.